Grace Hartwell was running out of time, and she knew it the way a deer knows the arrow is already in the air. Not because anyone told her, because her mother had laminated the spreadsheet, an actual laminated spreadsheet, with columns. Candidates ranked by territory size, bloodline purity, and something Catherine Hartwell had labeled political yield per offspring. Grace had found it tucked inside a cookbook in the kitchen, sandwiched between a recipe for lemon bars and a recipe for destroying your daughter's future. Tonight was the summit of alphas, the biggest gathering of pack leaders in the Northern Territories, an ancient tradition dressed up in tuxedos and champagne flutes, where alliances were forged, debts were settled, and unmated daughters of high-ranking wolves were walked across the ballroom floor like prize horses at auction. Grace was the prize horse this year. She stood in front of the mirror in her childhood bedroom, wearing a gown that cost more than most wolves earned in 6 months. Deep green silk, tailored to make her look like something worth bidding on. Her mother had chosen it, her father had approved it. Grace had not been consulted. Her reflection stared back at her with the hollow look of someone rehearsing their own funeral. "You look perfect," Catherine said from the doorway, adjusting the pearl earrings she wore to every formal event like they were part of her skeleton. "I look like bait," Grace said. Catherine's mouth thinned to a line so tight it could have cut glass. "You look like the eldest daughter of Alpha Henry Hartwell. You look like your future." "Whose future?" Grace asked, but her mother had already turned away, heels clicking down the hallway like a metronome counting down the seconds until Grace's life stopped belonging to her. The summit was held at Thornfield Hall, a sprawling estate in the mountains that the packs collectively maintained for exactly these kinds of events. Grand staircases, crystal chandeliers, marble floors polished to a shine that made you feel watched from below. Every surface screamed old money and older power. Grace walked through the entrance hall beside her father, who nodded at other alphas with the precise economy of a man who had already calculated the value of every handshake he would give tonight. Henry Hartwell was not cruel. That was what made him dangerous. Cruel men made mistakes. Henry simply made decisions, and the people inside those decisions learned to live with the shape he had chosen for them. Her younger sister Lily trailed behind them, 16 and wide-eyed, still young enough to find the chandeliers beautiful instead of threatening. Grace envied her that. In 2 years, Lily would be standing where Grace stood now. Another spreadsheet, another green dress, another auction disguised as a party. "The Ashford heir is here," Henry said, his voice low enough to be private, but loud enough to be a command. "You will speak with him before the second dance." "Speak with him," Grace repeated. "Is that what we are calling it?" Grace. One word. Her name, spoken the way he spoke it when he meant the conversation was already over. She had lost before she opened her mouth. She always lost before she opened her mouth. Dominic Ashford was standing near the bar with 3 other wolves who laughed at everything he said. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a suit so sharp it looked like it had been designed by someone who hated comfort. His jaw was square. His eyes were blue. His smile was the kind of smile that made Grace's skin try to crawl off her bones and find somewhere safer to live. He was, by every measurable standard, a catch. The Ashford pack controlled the eastern border territories. Rich land, strong warriors, political influence that stretched across 4 regions. On the laminated spreadsheet, Dominic Ashford sat at the top of the column like a crown. Grace watched him from across the room and felt nothing warm, nothing safe. She felt handled. She excused herself to the bathroom because it was the only room in Thornfield Hall that did not require her to perform. The hallway leading to the lower-level restrooms was narrow and poorly lit, which is the only reason she heard them. Dominic's voice. And another voice, deeper, belonging to his beta, a man named Craig whose neck was wider than his head. They were standing just around the corner, close enough that Grace could hear every word through the thin wall, pressed against the wallpaper like a thief stealing the truth about her own life. "Henry is practically gift-wrapping her," Dominic said. She could hear the smile in his voice. "The Hartwell girl, She will be bonded to me by the end of the month. She is a handful, from what I hear, Craig said. Dominic laughed. It was not a kind sound. Handfuls are easy to manage. You just have to know where to squeeze. Craig chuckled. The Hartwell territory is what matters, Dominic continued. Once the bond is sealed, Henry loses leverage. His pack folds into ours within a generation. The girl is just the delivery mechanism. Delivery mechanism. Grace's hands were shaking, not with fear, with something older than fear, something that lived in the part of her chest where the wolf curled around itself and growled at things that threatened the core of who she was. She did not hear the rest. She did not need to. Grace walked back down the hallway, past the bathroom she had been heading toward, past the grand staircase, past the champagne table where her mother was networking with lethal precision, past Lily, who called her name twice, past her father who reached for her arm and caught only air. She walked out the back doors of Thornfield Hall into the cool mountain night, still wearing the green silk dress, still wearing the shoes that pinched, still carrying the weight of the word delivery mechanism in her chest, like a stone she could not swallow and could not spit out. The grounds behind the hall stretched into forest, old trees, gravel paths that turned to dirt, that turned to nothing. Grace followed the nothing. Her heels sank into soft earth. She kicked them off. Barefoot on cold ground in a dress that was designed to make her someone else's future. She ran. Not gracefully, not like the heroines in the stories her grandmother used to tell, where the she-wolf fled into the moonlight with her hair streaming behind her like a banner. Grace ran like someone escaping a building that was on fire, all elbows and gasping and mascara running because her eyes were leaking and she could not make them stop. She ran until the music from the hall was just a murmur, until the lights from the windows were just a glow, until the forest was thick enough to swallow her. And then she hit the wall. The wall was warm. This was the first clue that it was not a wall. Walls were not warm in October, not this far up the mountain. The wall also grunted. Grace stumbled backward, her bare feet sliding on pine needles, and looked up at the thing she had crashed into. He was sitting on a fallen log at the tree line, just beyond the edge of the groomed grounds. No tuxedo, no champagne glass, no pack insignia pinned to his lapel like every other wolf at the summit. He was wearing a dark jacket that had been washed so many times the color was more memory than reality, and jeans, and boots that had walked a long way to get here. He smelled like pine smoke and engine oil, not cologne, not territory markers, just a man who had been somewhere real before he ended up here. Grace blinked at him through the mascara situation. He looked at her with steady brown eyes and said nothing. Grace started, and then stopped, because what was the end of that sentence? I just fled my own auction? I just discovered I am a delivery mechanism? I just ran barefoot into a forest, because a laminated spreadsheet was the thing that finally broke me. Bad party? He said. His voice was low and unhurried, like a man who had never once been in a rush to get anywhere. There was something in the cadence that she could not place, a rhythm that did not belong to any region she knew. The worst party, Grace said. He nodded, as if this was a sufficient explanation. He shifted slightly on the fallen log, making room. Not inviting, just making room, the way you clear space on a bench without making it a thing. Grace sat down. The silk dress pooled around her bare feet in the pine needles. Her toes were going numb. She could feel the cold earth beneath her soles, real and present, and nothing like the marble floors of Thornfield Hall. I am Grace, she said, because she did not know what else to say. Ethan, he said. No last name, no pack, no title. Just a first name, offered like a single coin. Take it or leave it. You are not here for the summit, Grace said. No. Then why are you sitting at the edge of it? He considered this. I like watching people pretend to be happy in expensive clothes. A laugh escaped her. A real one, the kind that sounds like a cough, because it has been trapped so long it forgot how to be a laugh. There is no pack scent on you, she said, and the realization landed in her stomach with a thud. No pack scent meant one thing. You are a rogue. Ethan did not flinch at the word. Most wolves did. Rogue was the lowest thing you could be. Packless, unaligned, a ghost in the hierarchy that held their entire world together. Packs pitied rogues. Alphas despised them. Mothers warned their children about them. Ethan just shrugged. "Does that matter to you?" he asked. Grace thought about the laminated spreadsheet, about the green dress, about delivery mechanism, about the marble floors that watched you from below, and the pearl earrings her mother wore like bones. "No," she said, "that does not matter to me at all." She sat there on the fallen log beside a rogue wolf and felt, for the first time in months, like the ground beneath her was solid. He did not try to fill the silence. He did not ask why she had been running, or why her mascara was ruined, or why the eldest daughter of Alpha Henry Hartwell was sitting barefoot in the dirt with a man who did not exist on any spreadsheet. The silence between them was the first honest thing she had experienced all night. Her phone buzzed in the hidden pocket of her dress. Her father. She ignored it. It buzzed again. Lily. She ignored that too. "They will come looking for me," Grace said. "Probably," Ethan said. "I do not want to go back." He did not say anything to that. He just sat with her while the mountain air cooled around them and the music from the hall grew tinier, more desperate, the sound of a world that needed her to hold still so it could keep turning. The idea arrived the way bad ideas always arrive. Not as a thought, as a feeling, a reckless hum in her bloodstream that made her fingertips tingle, and her wolf lift its head inside her chest. She looked at Ethan, at his worn jacket, his quiet hands, the absence of everything that the summit was trying to sell her. "I have a proposition," Grace said. He raised one eyebrow. "You are going to think I am insane. I already think you are sitting barefoot in a forest in a silk dress. The bar is set." Grace took a breath. The air tasted like pine and freedom and the specific flavor of a decision that would either save her or ruin her. "Marry me," she said. Ethan looked at her for a long time, the longest anyone had ever looked at her without trying to calculate what she was worth. "You do not know me," he said. "I know you are not Dominic Ashford." That hung in the air between them, heavy with everything it carried underneath. Ethan studied her face the way someone reads a letter they were not expecting, looking for the trick, the angle, the hidden column on the spreadsheet that explained why a girl in a green dress was proposing to a stranger in the woods. "Okay," he said. "Just that. Okay. No questions about what she was running from. No negotiations about what he would get out of it. No performance of surprise or gratitude or any of the things a rogue wolf should have felt when the daughter of an alpha offered him a bond that would change everything. Just okay, spoken in that unhurried voice, as if she had asked him to pass the salt. "Okay?" Grace repeated. "You heard me." Grace looked at him and felt something shift inside her chest. Not the mate bond, not yet. Something more dangerous. Hope. She pulled out her phone. Her father had called 4 more times. She typed a message to Lily instead. "I am fine. Do not come looking for me. Tell father I have made my own choice." She pressed send. The message delivered with a small swoosh that sounded, in the quiet of the forest, like the first breath of a very different life. Grace did not sleep that night. She sat in the passenger seat of Ethan's truck, a vehicle so old it had opinions about whether or not it wanted to start in the morning, and watched the forest peel away as they drove through the dark on a road that barely qualified for the title. The heater worked in bursts, like a friend who only showed up when it felt like it. The radio did not work at all. Ethan drove the way he spoke, steady, no rush, one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the gear shift like it belonged there. "Where are we going?" Grace asked. "My place." "And where is that?" "Up." That turned out to be accurate. The road climbed for 40 minutes, gaining elevation in hairpin curves that made the truck groan, until the pavement ended, and the dirt began, and the dirt eventually gave up too. Ethan parked between two pine trees so tall they made Grace feel like a crumb at the bottom of a cathedral. The cabin was small, that was the generous word for it. One room downstairs, a loft above it reached by a ladder, a kitchen that was more of a suggestion, and a wood stove in the corner that radiated the specific energy of an appliance that would work when it wanted to, and not a moment sooner. The porch was separating from the house. Not dramatically, just a slow, philosophical divorce. A 2-inch gap between the porch boards and the front wall that let the cold air in like an uninvited guest who had decided to stay. "Home," Ethan said, without irony. Grace stood in the doorway of the cabin wearing a green silk dress and bare feet with pine needles stuck between her toes, and thought, "This is the opposite of everything I was supposed to choose." "Good," she called her father the next morning. Or rather, her father called her 7 times before she answered. "Come home," Henry Hartwell said. "Not a request." "No. Grace, this is not a negotiation." "You are right, it is not." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Grace had ever heard. She could feel her father recalculating on the other end of the line, adjusting the columns and rows of his mental spreadsheet, trying to find the formula that would undo what she had done. "You cannot bond with a rogue," he said, finally. "Watch me." She hung up. Her hands were trembling. She pressed them flat against the wooden table in Ethan's kitchen, and breathed until the trembling stopped, and then she went outside and chopped wood, because Ethan had shown her how, and it turned out that swinging an axe was an excellent way to process the fact that you had just set fire to your entire life. The next 48 hours were a controlled demolition. Catherine Hartwell did not call. She simply stopped speaking to Grace, which Grace learned through Lily, who called from her bedroom closet in whispered bursts, like a spy reporting from behind enemy lines. "Mom took your photos off the mantel," Lily said. "Which photos?" "All of them." Grace closed her eyes. She had expected that, but expecting a wound and feeling it land are two different experiences entirely. "Dad has been in his office all day," Lily continued. "The elders came this morning, 5 of them. They were in there for 3 hours. When they left, Dad broke a glass." "Just one glass?" "The crystal decanter, the one Grandpa gave him." That was worse. Henry Hartwell did not break things. Henry Hartwell arranged things. He placed them in rows. He laminated them. The decanter meant the control was slipping, and a man like Henry without control was a man Grace did not want to be near. "Lily, listen to me. Stay out of his way." "I know. I mean it. Grace, I know." The mating ceremony happened 3 days later. Ethan had made one condition when he agreed. He picked where they lived. Grace assumed this meant the cabin, and she was right, but she did not expect the other part. He also picked the officiant. Her name was Ruth. She was ancient in the way that mountains are ancient, her face a landscape of lines that told stories Grace could not read. She arrived at the cabin in a truck even older than Ethan's, wearing a flannel shirt and boots caked with mud, and she looked at Grace with eyes so sharp they could have performed surgery. "This the one?" Ruth said to Ethan. "This is her," Ethan said. Ruth studied Grace for a long moment. Then she smiled, and the smile cracked her face open like sunrise breaking over stone. "Good bones," Ruth said. "Good wolf. Terrible taste in footwear, but we can fix that." Grace looked down at her borrowed boots, 2 sizes too large, stuffed with newspaper in the toes. "They are practical," Grace said. "They are crimes," Ruth said. "Come inside. Let us do this before I lose daylight." The ceremony was nothing like the bonding rituals Grace had grown up watching. No witnesses from either family. No exchange of territory agreements. No speeches about alliance and legacy, and the sacred duty of bloodline continuation. Ruth spoke words in a language Grace did not recognize, old words that sounded like they had been carved out of the earth rather than spoken from a mouth. Ethan stood across from her in the same jacket he had been wearing the night they met, and he looked at her with those steady brown eyes, and when the moment came for the bite, he paused. "You are sure," he said. Not a question. A door left open. I am sure. The bite. And then the bond. Grace had been told about the mate bond her entire life. Every wolf was. The stories described it as warmth, as completion, as finding the missing piece of yourself in another person. Poetic nonsense designed to make the arranged matings feel less like transactions. This was not warmth. This was not completion. This was a door blowing open inside her chest, and a wind rushing through that rearranged every piece of furniture in every room she had ever built inside herself. It was not gentle. It was not poetic. It was a living thing that grabbed her ribcage and said, "Here, this is yours now, carry it." She staggered. Ethan caught her arm. His hand was warm and rough, and it steadied her, and through the bond she could feel something from him, something vast and controlled and carefully contained, like a lake that was much deeper than its still surface suggested. "That was," Grace started. "Yeah," Ethan said. Ruth watched them both with an expression that contained at least 11 different emotions, none of which she chose to share. "Done," Ruth said. "Do not mess this up." She left. Grace and Ethan stood in the cabin in the silence that followed, two strangers who had just tied their souls together to win an argument with a spreadsheet. The first weeks were brutal. Grace Hartwell had been raised with staff, a cook, a housekeeper, drivers, people whose job it was to make sure the physical world cooperated. In the cabin, the physical world did not cooperate. It actively fought her. The wood stove required a specific kind of coaxing that was more relationship than technique. You had to talk to it, Ethan explained without any apparent irony. Not literally, but with your hands. The way you stacked the kindling, the angle of the flue. If you rushed it, the stove would fill the cabin with smoke out of pure spite. The water came from a well. It tasted like iron and cold earth, and it took Grace 3 days to stop gagging on it. The nearest grocery store was a 45-minute drive on the good road, which was not the road to the cabin, so the actual trip involved an hour and 15 minutes of arguing with gravity on a dirt track that washed out every time it rained. Grace learned to chop wood. She learned to haul water. She learned to cook on the temperamental stove, which accepted her offerings about 60% of the time, and rejected the rest with a belch of smoke that left her coughing on the porch, while Ethan watched from the doorway with an expression she could not decode. He was an impossible man to read. Ethan spoke in sentences the way some people spent money, carefully, rarely, never more than was absolutely necessary. He could go entire mornings without saying a word, moving through the cabin and the surrounding forest with the efficiency of someone who had been living alone for so long that silence was not absence but language. He cooked one meal, a stew, dark, thick, rich, flavored with herbs Grace could not name and spices she could not identify. It tasted like it had history, like the recipe had been passed down through enough hands that it carried the fingerprints of generations. He made it every third night and refused to make anything else. "Why only the stew?" Grace asked on the 5th night, sitting across from him at the small table with the bond humming between them like a wire stretched tight. "It is what I know," Ethan said. "You could learn other things." "I could." He did not. Grace watched him in the spaces between the silences, the way he checked every window before sleep, moving through the cabin in a circuit so practiced it had become invisible, his hand brushing each latch with the casual precision of someone who had learned a long time ago that unlocked windows were not an option. The way he positioned himself between her and any door without appearing to do it deliberately, as if his body had its own geometry that always placed him between her and the exit. The way his hand would drift to his ribs, to a spot beneath his shirt on the left side, and press there with the flat of his palm before he caught himself and stopped. She saw the scar once. He was changing his shirt by the wood stove, his back half turned to her, and she caught a glimpse of it before he pulled the fresh shirt down. A mark on his ribs, on the left side, exactly where his hand always went. Not a wound, not a scratch, a shape, deliberate, burned into the skin. It looked like a crown, branded, not born. Grace did not ask about it, not because she was not curious, but because the bond told her something when she looked at that scar, something that came through the connection like a warning bell wrapped in cotton. Not danger, not pain, something older than both, a secret that had weight, that would change the shape of the room if she pulled it into the light. She was not ready. Instead, she learned his other contradictions. The satellite phone hidden under the floorboards, which she discovered on her 9th day in the cabin when she dropped a fork and it rolled into the gap between 2 boards, and she pried them up to retrieve it, and found the phone nestled in a cavity that had been carved deliberately, wrapped in cloth. The letters in his desk drawer, written in a script she could not read, a language she had never seen, with an alphabet that looked like it had been designed by someone who thought in angles rather than curves. The books on the shelf above the bed in the loft, philosophy and military history, and a battered collection of poetry in that same angular language, the spine cracked, and the pages soft from being handled. He was reading the poetry book one evening when Grace climbed the ladder to the loft and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at him. "What language is that?" she asked. Ethan closed the book. Not fast, not guiltily, but the way someone closes a door they are not ready to open for someone else. "Old one," he said. "That is not an answer. It is the answer I have right now." Grace wanted to push. The bond wanted her to push. It was doing that thing it did, tugging at the edges of her attention, pulling her toward him the way gravity pulls water downhill, not with force, but with inevitability. She did not push. She climbed back down the ladder and went outside and stood on the separating porch and breathed the cold air until the wanting quieted to something she could carry without stumbling. A week later, her phone rang. Not her personal phone. The cabin's landline, a rotary phone mounted on the kitchen wall that Grace had assumed was decorative because who in this century owned a rotary phone? It rang. Ethan answered it in the language from the books. Grace stood in the doorway of the kitchen and listened to her husband speak in a voice she had never heard before. Not louder, not deeper, fuller, as if the man she had married was a room he only occupied halfway, and now, on this phone call, he had walked into the rest of it. The voice that spoke in that unknown language was the voice of someone who was used to being listened to, not because he demanded it, because people leaned in when he spoke. He hung up. He saw her standing there. For 1 second, one fraction of a breath, something crossed his face that she recognized through the bond. Not guilt, calculation, the quick, fluid math of a man deciding how much truth the moment could hold. "Work," he said. "You do not have a job. I have things I take care of." Grace stared at him. He stared back. The bond hummed between them, a wire pulled so tight it was almost singing. "Okay," she said. She did not believe him. She filed it away in the growing cabinet of things she was not ready to open, alongside the branded scar, and the satellite phone, and the letters in angular script, and the poetry book he held like it was a letter from someone he missed. She went back to chopping wood. The axe bit into the log with a sound that was deeply satisfying, a clean crack that split the silence the way the truth would eventually split everything else. But not yet. Not today. Today she chopped wood and carried water and coaxed the wood stove into cooperation and sat across from a stranger she had married out of spite and felt, beneath the confusion and the fear and the slow burn of curiosity that was eating her alive, something she refused to name. Something that felt like the beginning of a very long fall. 3 weeks passed. The cabin settled around them like a third presence, its creaks and groans becoming a language Grace learned alongside the silence of the man she had married. October turned cold, then colder, and the wood stove became less of a companion and more of a necessity, and Grace found herself grateful for the hours she had spent learning its moods. She was chopping wood on a Tuesday morning when the first dead wolf was found. She did not find it herself. She heard about it the way she heard about most things from the outside world, through Lily, who called from the closet in their parents' house with the breathless precision of a girl who had learned to spy out of love. "There was a rogue killed on the eastern border," Lily said. Dad is in his office with 3 betas. They have been in there since dawn. Killed how? Nobody is saying. But Grace, the way the betas looked when they arrived. I have never seen wolves look like that. Scared. Actually scared. Grace hung up and stood in the kitchen of the cabin with the phone in her hand and the bond twisting in her chest like a compass needle trying to find north. Ethan was not home. He had left before sunrise, the way he did some mornings, slipping out of the loft with a quietness that was not stealth but habit, the practiced silence of someone who had been leaving rooms without waking people for a very long time. He came back at noon smelling like distance and cold air, and something underneath both that Grace's wolf identified before her brain could catch up. Blood. Not his own. That was the second thing she noticed. The blood was not his. "Where were you?" Grace asked. Ethan pulled off his jacket and hung it on the hook by the door, and went to the sink and washed his hands with the deliberate thoroughness of someone who had done this many times before. His hands were large and capable, and the water ran clean after a long time of running not clean. "Walking," he said. "Walking? Yeah. For 6 hours. I walk far." Grace watched his jaw. It was doing something she had never seen it do before, a tightness along the hinge that made the muscle there jump, in a rhythm she could feel through the bond, a distant percussion of something tightly leashed. She did not push. She had learned, in 3 weeks of marriage, that pushing Ethan was like pushing a mountain. Not because he resisted, because he simply did not move. He would stand in the question and let it exist around him without answering it, and eventually the question would get tired and sit down, and Grace would be left with nothing but the echoing shape of the thing she had wanted to know. But she was watching. She was always watching. The second dead wolf was found 4 days later. Then a third. Then 2 more, in the same night, on the northern boundary of the Ashford territory. Lily reported each one with increasing urgency, her whispered calls from the closet growing shorter, more clipped, the words stripped down to their bones. 5 now, all rogues, all killed the same way. Nobody is talking about how, but I overheard Craig telling Dad it was military. Clean. Professional. Like soldiers, not wolves. Grace felt the word military land in her stomach, and stay there. She thought about the books on Ethan's shelf. Philosophy, military history, strategy. She thought about the way he checked the windows, the way his body oriented itself around doors and exits, the branded scar shaped like a crown. She thought about the phone calls in the language she did not know, and the voice that came out of him during those calls, fuller and larger and shaped for command. She thought about all of it, and then she chopped wood until her arms screamed, because physical pain was simpler than the growing certainty that the man she had married was much more than a rogue who liked to watch parties from the tree line. The calls increased. 3 times a week became every night. Ethan would slip out of the loft after he thought Grace was asleep and go downstairs and dial the satellite phone and speak in that angular language for 20 minutes, sometimes 30, and his voice during those calls carried an authority that made the air in the cabin feel different, denser, the way the atmosphere changes before a storm. Grace was not asleep during these calls. She lay in the loft with her eyes open in the dark and listened, and through the bond she caught fragments. Not words, emotions. His emotions, leaking through the connection he kept so carefully controlled. Concern, calculation, a cold, focused anger that burned clean, without smoke, the anger of someone who was used to carrying rage as a tool, rather than an affliction. She started exploring the cabin while he was gone on his walks. She was not proud of it. She told herself she was cleaning, organizing, making the small space livable for 2 people instead of 1. But her hands kept finding things that were not meant to be found. Under a loose board in the kitchen, beside the satellite phone she had already discovered, she found a second compartment. Inside it were maps. Not printed maps, but hand-drawn ones. In ink, on paper that felt old, depicting territories she did not recognize. Borders that did not match any pack boundary she had learned in her father's study. Markers in that angular script, labels she could not read, but the geography was familiar. These were the Northern Territories, but the borders were different, older. In the back of the closet, behind a row of flannel shirts that all looked identical but apparently served distinct purposes Ethan had never explained, she found a box. Wooden. Locked. Small enough to hold in two hands but heavy enough to contain something that mattered. She did not try to open it. The bond told her not to. Not in words, but in a pulse of something that felt like the edge of a cliff. A warning that this particular truth had a drop on the other side she could not see the bottom of. She put the box back. She rearranged the flannel shirts. She went outside and stood on the slowly divorcing porch and breathed. A week later, Dominic Ashford made his move. It did not come as an attack. It came as a letter, handwritten. Delivered by a wolf, Grace did not recognize who appeared at the edge of the tree line around the cabin, and left the envelope pinned beneath a stone, and vanished before Grace could reach the door. The letter was addressed to her. The handwriting was beautiful. Dominic Ashford had the penmanship of a man who had been raised to believe that presentation was indistinguishable from substance. Grace, I hope the novelty of playing house with your rogue has worn thin by now. The Northern Summit reconvenes in spring. Your father has agreed to discuss dissolution of your current bond. This unpleasantness does not need to continue. You will come home. We will proceed as planned. I am patient, but my patience is a courtesy, not a commitment. He did not sign it. He did not need to. Grace read it twice. The second time, she read it out loud, and her voice did not shake, which she considered a victory. Then she folded the letter and placed it in the wood stove and watched Dominic Ashford's beautiful penmanship curl and blacken and disappear. Ethan was not home when the letter arrived. He was not home when she burned it. He returned at dusk, walking out of the tree line with that long stride that covered ground without appearing to hurry, and he paused at the door and looked at Grace, and the bond between them rippled with something she could not name. Something happened, he said, not a question. I handled it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded and went inside and made the stew, and they ate in a silence that was different from the usual silence. Charged. The air between them carrying the static of things unsaid, a weather system building toward something that neither of them was steering and neither of them could stop. That night, Grace woke to a sound she had never heard before. Ethan was downstairs, on the satellite phone. But his voice was different, louder than he had ever let it get in the cabin, the restraint stripped away, and even though she could not understand the words, she understood the tone. Command. Absolute, unquestioned command. He was giving orders. The call ended. Grace lay in the dark with her heart hammering and the bond vibrating between them, and through it, she felt something from Ethan that she had never felt before. Fear. Not for himself. She knew the difference by now, had learned to read the emotional frequencies that traveled along their bond like signals along a wire. This fear was directional. It pointed at something specific, something outside the cabin, something that was moving toward them in the dark. Toward her. He was afraid for her. Grace closed her eyes and pretended to sleep when he climbed the ladder to the loft. He stood at the top of the ladder for a moment, and she could feel him watching her, could feel the weight of his attention like a hand hovering above her skin. Then he lay down beside her, and his hand found hers in the dark, and he held it. He had never done that before. Grace held his hand back and did not open her eyes and listened to his breathing slow toward sleep, and her mind spun with the dead rogues on the borders and the letter from Dominic and the maps of territories that did not exist anymore, and the branded crown on her husband's ribs, and the full, commanding voice on the satellite phone, and the fear that was not for himself. She was married to a secret. The secret was getting bigger, and the thing it was growing toward was something she could feel, approaching the way animals feel earthquakes before the ground begins to move. 3 days later, Ethan left before dawn and did not come back by noon. By 2 in the afternoon, Grace was pacing the cabin. By 4, she was standing on the porch, scanning the tree line with her arms crossed, willing the familiar shape of his stride to emerge from between the pines. By 6, the sun was dropping and the woods were turning to shadow, and Grace's wolf was pressing against the inside of her chest with an urgency that had nothing to do with the bond and everything to do with instinct. Something was wrong. She was reaching for the satellite phone under the floorboards when the truck appeared. Not Ethan's truck, a black vehicle, newer, cleaner, with no plates and tinted windows, and the kind of engine sound that said money. 3 wolves stepped out. Grace had grown up around dominant wolves. Her father was an alpha. Dominic Ashford was an heir to a powerful pack. She knew what strength smelled like, tasted like, felt like in the air around powerful men. These 3 wolves made her father feel like a school teacher. They were large, trained. They moved with a synchronization that was not practiced but ingrained, the kind of movement that came from a pack bond so deep it had dissolved the borders between individual bodies. They wore no insignia, carried no weapons that Grace could see, but they did not need weapons. Their bodies were the weapons. They walked toward the cabin. They saw Grace on the porch. They dropped to one knee. All 3, in unison, heads down, fists pressed to the ground, the posture of wolves submitting to someone who outranked every alpha Grace had ever met. "My lady," the one in front said, his voice tight with deference, "we bring word for the king." The king. Grace stood on the separating porch of the cabin in the mountains and felt the word land in the center of her chest, like a stone dropped into still water. The king. Ethan emerged from the tree line behind the truck. He saw the 3 wolves kneeling. He saw Grace standing above them on the porch, with her face open and stunned, and the bond between them screaming with the sudden, electric clarity of a truth that could no longer be contained. He stopped walking. His eyes met hers, and in that moment, the man she had married, the man who made one stew and spoke in single sentences and shrugged when she proposed and held her hand in the dark, made a decision. She could feel it through the bond. The shape of a lie forming, the architecture of an explanation designed to preserve the small, quiet life they had built in this cabin, with its divorcing porch and its temperamental stove. "Leave," Ethan said to the 3 wolves. His voice was the voice from the phone calls. Full, heavy, a voice that had been shaped by something much larger than this cabin and this mountain and this woman he had married on a Tuesday. They left. They got in the black vehicle and drove away without another word, because the voice that told them to leave was not a voice that invited discussion. Ethan climbed the porch steps. He stood in front of Grace. The gap between them was 2 feet and also infinite. "I can explain," he said. Grace looked at him, at his worn jacket, his steady eyes, the place on his ribs where the crown was branded into his skin, hidden beneath flannel and silence, and weeks of careful, deliberate deception. "They called you king," she said. Ethan did not flinch. He absorbed the word the way a wall absorbs rain, letting it run down without letting it in. "Grace," he said, "they called you king, and they kneeled. I know what they did." "Then tell me what you are." He opened his mouth. She watched the lie assemble itself behind his eyes, brick by careful brick, the practiced construction of a man who had been building walls around himself for so long that it was not deception anymore. It was architecture. It was who he was. "Do not," Grace said, "do not lie to me. Not tonight. Not after I burned a letter from a man who thinks he owns me, and held your hand in the dark, and chopped your wood, and ate your stew, and married you on a Tuesday, because I thought you were the one honest thing in my life." Her voice cracked on the last word. Ethan stood very still. Through the bond, she felt the wall behind his eyes tremble. Not fall. Tremble. The first vibration of a structure that had been standing for a very long time and was not yet ready to come down. "Not tonight," he said. It was not a refusal, it was a plea. The first time she had ever heard him ask for something. Grace looked at the man who might be a king and felt the rage rise in her throat, hot and bitter, and behind it, worse, the understanding. She was married to a secret, and the secret was not ready to be born. "Tomorrow," she said. Ethan nodded. They went inside. He made the stew. They ate in silence. They climbed the ladder to the loft and lay in the dark side by side, and he did not hold her hand, and she did not reach for his, and the 2 feet of mattress between them was the loudest distance Grace had ever heard. The call came at 4 in the morning. Not the satellite phone. Not Ethan's hidden line. Grace's own phone, buzzing on the nightstand in the loft, with Lily's name on the screen, and when Grace answered, her sister was not whispering from the closet. She was screaming. The sound cut through the dark of the cabin like a blade. Grace was upright before her eyes were open, the phone pressed to her ear, the bond flooding with adrenaline that was half hers and half Ethan's, their fear braiding together into something sharp and electric. "Lily, Lily, talk to me." "They took me." Lily's voice was fracturing. "Grace, they took me. I am in a car. I do not know where. They came into the house. They came into my room. 3 of them. Dad tried to stop them. They hurt Dad. Grace, they hurt Dad and Mom is screaming, and they put something over my face, and I woke up in a car." "Who? Who took you?" Silence. Then a different voice, male, calm the way a blade is calm. "Hello, Grace." Craig, Dominic's beta. The man whose neck was wider than his head, the same man who had chuckled in that hallway at the summit when Dominic called her a delivery mechanism. "Your sister is comfortable," Craig said. "She will remain comfortable, as long as you cooperate. Mr. Ashford's terms are simple. You will present yourself at the Ashford estate within 48 hours. You will submit to a bond dissolution. Once the dissolution is complete, and you are free of the rogue, you will bond with Mr. Ashford as originally planned." Grace could not speak. Her voice had left her body and was standing somewhere across the room, watching her from a distance. "If you do not comply," Craig continued, "your sister will be returned to your father in pieces, 1 piece per day that you delay. Mr. Ashford wants you to understand that this is not a negotiation." The line went dead. Grace sat in the dark of the loft with the phone in her hand and the world dissolving around her. Bond dissolution. The words rattled through her skull like stones in a metal box. Forced bond dissolution was an act so old and so brutal that it had been outlawed for 2 centuries. It required ripping the mating bond out of both wolves through a ritual that left permanent damage, scars that never healed, psychological wounds that could drive a wolf mad. It had been used as punishment in the oldest days, when alphas had the power of kings. Kings. She turned to look at Ethan. He was already awake, already sitting up. His eyes in the darkness of the loft were not the steady brown she knew. They were darker, harder. The eyes of someone who had been waiting for this, who had known it was coming the way you know winter is coming, by the way the air tastes in October. "You heard," Grace said. "I heard. They have my sister." "I know. Ethan. I know, Grace." She looked at him, and the bond between them, already straining under weeks of half-truths and locked boxes and branded scars, vibrated with something new, urgency. The particular vibration of a man making a decision that cannot be unmade. "I need to tell you something," Ethan said. "Now? You choose now. I do not have the luxury of tomorrow anymore." Grace stared at him. The loft was dark. The wood stove below was dead, the cabin cold, the porch outside creaking in the wind like the bones of an old animal trying to stand. "Then tell me," she said. Ethan got out of bed. He climbed down the ladder. Grace followed, because whatever was about to happen was not a loft conversation. It was a standing-up conversation, the kind that changed the shape of everything that came after. He pulled the box from the back of the closet, the locked one, the heavy one. He set it on the kitchen table and opened it with a key he wore around his neck, a key so small Grace had mistaken it for a charm, a decoration, a meaningless piece of metal hanging from a leather cord. Inside the box were 3 things. A ring, heavy gold, old, carved with symbols in the angular language Grace had seen in his books and letters. A signet ring, the kind worn by men who ruled. A seal, a metal stamp, tarnished with age, bearing the same crown shape that was branded into his ribs. And a letter, folded, yellowed, written in English, in a hand that Grace recognized with a shock that traveled from her fingertips to the base of her skull. Ruth's handwriting, the half-blind elder who had performed their mating ceremony. "Read it," Ethan said. Grace unfolded the letter. It was addressed to Henry Hartwell, and it was dated 12 years ago. Alpha Hartwell. This letter serves as formal notice that the first pack has not perished. The bloodline continues. My grandson carries the title and the burden. He has chosen withdrawal, not extinction. The packs will not be contacted. The territories will not be claimed. This is not mercy. This is observation. We are watching to see if you deserve to survive. Do not look for us. Do not speak of this. If you do, we will not withdraw again. We will return. And returning is not something any of you want to see. Ruth Cole. Cole. Ethan Cole. Grace set the letter down on the table and looked at her husband and felt the world crack open along a fault line she had been standing on for weeks without knowing it. "The first pack," she said. Ethan stood across the table from her, his hands at his sides, his face stripped of the careful blankness he wore like armor. For the first time since she had met him, he looked exposed, the bones of the truth showing through the skin. "My full name is Ethan Cole. I am the Alpha King of the first pack, the original bloodline, the wolves who wrote the laws that every modern pack still follows. The first pack died out 3 generations ago," Grace said. "Everyone knows that. Everyone knows what we wanted them to know." Grace's hands were flat on the table. She pressed them down hard because the kitchen was tilting and she needed something solid to hold on to. "You did not die out. We withdrew, pulled our people into the deep territories, erased our scent signatures. We have been watching the summit politics from a distance for 30 years. Watching for what? For whether the packs were worth saving." The words landed between them like something dropped from a great height. "My grandmother wrote that letter to your father 12 years ago," Ethan continued. "He has known who I am since before you were old enough to attend a summit. He buried the knowledge, used it as insurance, a secret he could trade if his back ever hit the wall." "Ruth," Grace said, "Ruth is your grandmother." "She is. She is not half blind. She is not blind at all." Grace closed her eyes. The mating ceremony. Ruth's sharp eyes, good bones, good wolf. The way Ethan had said this is her, as if he were presenting Grace for inspection, for approval, for something that mattered far more than a spite marriage in a cabin with a broken porch. "You knew," Grace said. "You knew who I was when I ran into you at the summit. I knew your family. You were there for a reason. I was there to watch. I had been watching for years, attending summits from the tree line, observing how the alphas governed, whether the structures were holding, whether the packs had earned the right to continue using the laws my ancestors built. And they had not. The packs were rotting from the inside. Alphas like Dominic Ashford were proof. Men who treated bonds as transactions and territories as trophies and daughters as delivery mechanisms." Grace flinched at the phrase, the same words she had heard in the hallway at Thornfield Hall, spoken now by a man who had apparently heard them too. "You heard what Dominic said about me," she said. "I heard everything that happened at the summit. My people were everywhere. Staff, servers, groundskeepers. We have been embedded for years." Grace felt her legs weaken. She pulled out a chair and sat down, because standing was no longer something she could do reliably. "I did not expect you," Ethan said. His voice changed when he said it. Softer. The command drained out, and what was left was the man on the log. The man who made space on the bench without making it a thing. "I did not expect you to run out of that building like you were on fire, with your mascara ruined and your shoes gone, and crash into me at the tree line. I did not expect the bond. I did not expect any of it. But you said yes. I said yes, because you asked a rogue wolf to marry you, to escape a man who called you a delivery mechanism, and you looked at me like I was the first real thing you had seen all night, and I thought, this is the wolf I have been watching for. Not the alphas, not the elders, this one, the one who would rather burn everything down than be sold. Grace sat at the kitchen table in a cabin in the mountains with the ring and the seal and the letter laid out before her, and her sister screaming in her memory, and her husband's true name ringing in the air, and she felt two things at once that should have been impossible to hold at the same time. Fury, because he had lied. Every silent morning, every shrugged answer, every single sentence response was a lie of omission, a wall built between them, brick by deliberate brick. And beneath the fury, something deeper and more terrifying, the understanding that the lie was love, that he had hidden himself not to deceive her, but to give her the one thing no one else had ever offered her. A choice. He had been the rogue, so she could choose the rogue. Not the king, not the title, not the territory. The man on the log who smelled like pine smoke and engine oil, and who held her hand in the dark. The bond surged between them. Grace felt it like a tide, pulling her toward him with a force that had nothing to do with magic, and everything to do with the aching, furious recognition that this impossible man had tried to love her honestly by lying about everything he was. "My sister," Grace said, because fury and understanding could wait. Lily could not. Ethan's face changed. The softness left. What replaced it was the thing she had felt through the bond on the night of the phone call. The cold, clean focus of a man who had been born to lead armies. "Dominic Ashford will not keep your sister," Ethan said, "and he will not touch you. And the bond dissolution he is threatening is a ritual that requires the authority of a sitting Alpha King to perform." He picked up the signet ring from the table and held it in his palm. "There has not been a sitting Alpha King in 3 generations," he said, "until now." He called the satellite phone. This time, Grace stood beside him and listened. She still could not understand the language, but she understood the rhythm. Short, precise. The cadence of orders being given to people who had been waiting a long time to receive them. The calls took 11 minutes. When he hung up, he looked at Grace. "How many?" she asked. "Enough." They drove through the dark. Not in Ethan's truck. In the black vehicle that appeared at the edge of the tree line within 20 minutes of the phone calls, driven by a woman with short gray hair and the quiet intensity of someone who had been a soldier for longer than Grace had been alive. Her name was Patricia Cole. She was Ethan's cousin. She greeted Grace with a nod that contained decades of practiced composure and a look that said, "Welcome to the family. Buckle up." They drove toward the Hartwell pack house, not the Ashford estate. The Hartwell pack house, because Ethan explained in the car, his voice calm and measured, that Henry Hartwell had known who Ethan was for 12 years and had done nothing, had let his daughter marry into the first pack without a word of warning or acknowledgement, had sat on the knowledge like a card in his sleeve while his youngest daughter was kidnapped from her bedroom. "Your father is not innocent in this," Ethan said. "I know," Grace said. "I have always known." The Hartwell pack house was lit up like a disaster when they arrived. Every window blazing, cars in the driveway, wolves on the perimeter, agitated, pacing. Henry Hartwell's security detail had been doubled, and they challenged the black vehicle at the gate with weapons drawn. Patricia did not slow down. The wolves at the gate caught Ethan's scent as the vehicle passed, and something happened that Grace would never forget. The challenge died in their throats. Their weapons lowered, their bodies shifted from aggression to deference in a single, involuntary motion, the way a compass needle swings when you bring a magnet close. They knew. Their wolves knew, even if their human minds did not. Something ancient and hierarchical in their blood recognized the scent of the first pack, the original authority, the foundation upon which every pack law and every territory border and every summit tradition had been built. Ethan walked into the Hartwell pack house, flanked by Patricia and 2 other wolves who materialized from the shadows beside the front door, silent, enormous, moving like extensions of a single will, and behind them, visible through the trees at the edge of the property, more shapes. Dozens. Then more. Wolves emerging from the northern forest in absolute silence, filling the tree line with eyes that glowed in the dark. The first pack had not died. They had been waiting, and now they were here. Henry Hartwell met them in the entrance hall. He looked at Ethan. He looked at the ring on Ethan's hand, the signet ring that had not been seen in public in 3 generations. He looked at the wolves filling his property like a tide coming in. His face did something Grace had never seen it do. It surrendered. "You knew," Grace said to her father. "Grace, You knew who he was. For 12 years. You knew when I married him. You knew when you disowned me. You knew when Dominic took Lily." Henry Hartwell, alpha of the Hartwell pack, the man who never broke things and never lost control and laminated spreadsheets because chaos was his only enemy, looked at his eldest daughter and had nothing to say that could fill the space between what he had known and what he had allowed. "The Ashford estate," Ethan said. His voice was the voice from the phone calls. The full voice. The king's voice. "Where is Lily being held?" "The East Wing," Henry said. "Basement level. Craig is with her. Dominic has 8 wolves guarding the perimeter." 8, Ethan said. He did not smile, but something shifted in his expression that was worse than a smile. The quiet certainty of a man for whom 8 wolves was not a problem but a formality. "I want my sister back before dawn," Grace said. "You will have her," Ethan said. The Ashford estate fell in under an hour. Not through battle, through something more devastating, through presence. Through the weight of 300 wolves emerging from the darkness around a house that was defended by 8, surrounding it in a ring of absolute silence that said, more clearly than any threat could have, "This is over. You just do not know it yet." Dominic Ashford came to the front door in a bathrobe. Grace would remember that for the rest of her life. The heir to the Ashford pack, the man who had beautiful penmanship and a smile that made her skin crawl, standing in his doorway in a bathrobe while 300 wolves, who should not have existed, stared at him from his own lawn. Ethan walked up the steps alone. "You will release Lily Hartwell," he said. "Who are you supposed to be?" Dominic said, but his voice cracked on the last word, because his wolf was screaming inside him. His wolf recognized the scent, the authority, the ancient weight of the bloodline standing 3 feet away. Ethan held up his hand. The signet ring caught the porch light. Dominic's face went white. "That is not possible," he whispered. "The first pack is dead." "We are standing on your lawn," Ethan said. "Does that seem dead to you?" Craig brought Lily out 4 minutes later. She was shaking. Her wrists were bruised. She had a cut above her left eyebrow that had not been tended, but she was whole, and when she saw Grace standing at the bottom of the steps, she ran. Grace caught her sister and held her and felt the bond in her chest roar with something primal and fierce and impossibly protective, and over Lily's shoulder she watched Ethan Cole, the alpha king of the first pack, look at Dominic Ashford with an expression that contained no anger. Something worse. Judgment. "You kidnapped a child," Ethan said. "You threatened bond dissolution, a ritual that carries the death penalty under first pack law. You conspired to force a mated wolf into a bond against her will." "You have no authority," Dominic said, but his voice was the voice of a man trying to hold up a building that was already falling. "I am the only authority," Ethan said. The alphas came, not just the Ashford wolves and the Hartwells. All of them. Word traveled through the pack networks with the speed of something that had been waiting to happen, a truth that the whole system had been straining toward without knowing it. The Alpha King was alive. The first pack had returned. The hierarchy that every modern wolf took for granted, the territories, the summits, the laws, all of it was built on a foundation that had just announced it was still here, and it had opinions. They came to the Hartwell pack house because Ethan chose it. A deliberate decision, Grace realized. He could have held court anywhere. He could have taken the Ashford estate, could have claimed any territory in the northern region by right of original authority. Instead, he chose the house where Grace had grown up, the house her mother had removed her photos from. They submitted. One by one, the alphas of the Northern Territories knelt before a man in a worn jacket who smelled like pine smoke and who had been living in a cabin with a broken porch for years, watching them through the trees, deciding whether they were worth the laws his family had written. Some knelt willingly, others knelt because their wolves gave them no choice. The animal inside them recognized the hierarchy the way bones recognize gravity. Dominic Ashford was given a choice that was not really a choice. Exile or submission. He chose exile. He left the Northern Territories that night with Craig and 2 loyal wolves and nothing else. His pack was dissolved. His territory was redistributed. His beautiful penmanship would write no more letters to women he considered property. Henry Hartwell knelt last. Grace watched her father lower himself to one knee before her husband and felt the bond shiver with something complicated. Not satisfaction, not revenge, something quieter. The recognition that the spreadsheet, the laminated columns and rows of candidates ranked by political yield, was the product of a man who had mistaken control for strength and calculation for love, and now the thing he had been trying to control was standing above him wearing a signet ring and holding his daughter's loyalty in a way he never could. Grace stood in the entrance hall of her childhood home, with her sister beside her and her husband wearing a crown he had hidden in a wooden box, and she felt the mate bond between them sing with something enormous, a frequency that had been there since the first bite, buried beneath the silence and the stew and the single sentences. The bond of a king, the bond of a bloodline that stretched back to the beginning of their kind. It was overwhelming, it was vast, it made the cabin feel small and the mountain feel like a foothill, and the entire Northern Territory feel like a single room in a house that was much, much larger than anything she had imagined. Grace looked at Ethan across the hall, through the kneeling wolves and the power and the history and the 300 silent warriors who had emerged from the forest like ghosts made flesh. He looked back at her, and his eyes were the same eyes. Brown, steady, the eyes of the man on the log who had made space on the bench without making it a thing. The king's eyes and the rogue's eyes were the same eyes. She was furious. Grace refused the title. She said it clearly, in front of the assembled alphas, in front of her father who was still on one knee, in front of Ruth who had arrived at the Hartwell pack house in her muddy boots and flannel shirt, and was watching from the back of the room with an expression that suggested she had expected exactly this. "I am not your queen," Grace said. Ethan did not argue. The alphas shifted uncomfortably. Patricia Cole raised one eyebrow. Ruth smiled. "I married a rogue," Grace continued. "I married a man with no pack and no title and no name other than Ethan because I was trying to be free. I burned my family. I left my home. I learned to chop wood and carry water and negotiate with a wood stove that hated me. I did all of that because I refused to be sold, and I am not going to let you put a different price tag on me and call it an honor." The room was silent. 300 wolves, and not a single one breathed. "You hid this from me," Grace said, turning to Ethan. "You hid who you were, what you are, everything. You let me think I was choosing a nothing, a nobody. You let me think I was free." "You were free," Ethan said. "I was ignorant. That is not the same thing." Ethan stood at the front of the room in his worn jacket with the signet ring on his hand and the weight of an entire kingdom on his shoulders, and he did not defend himself. He absorbed her words the way the mountain absorbed rain, without deflection, without excuse. "You are right," he said. 2 words, the same 2 words he used when she told him she was sure at the mating ceremony. Grace looked at him and felt the fury and the understanding crash together inside her chest like 2 waves meeting, the collision sending spray in every direction, soaking everything, leaving nothing dry. She turned and walked out of the room. Lily followed her. They sat on the back steps of the Hartwell pack house in the cold morning air while the political reshaping of the entire Northern Territory happened inside without them. Lily's wrists were still bruised. The cut above her eyebrow had been cleaned and bandaged by a medic from the first pack, a quiet woman who had treated Lily with the careful tenderness of someone who understood that some wounds are smaller than they look, and some are bigger. "He is a king," Lily said. "Yes. You married a king. I married a rogue who turned out to be a king. There is a difference." "Is there?" Grace did not answer, because she did not have one. The days that followed were a storm Grace had to learn to walk through. The political machinery of the Northern Territories was grinding into new shapes. Alphas, who had governed unchallenged for decades, were being held to standards they had forgotten existed. The laws of the First Pack, the original code that had been written before territories were divided and summits were invented, were being dusted off and applied with the precision of a scalpel. Ethan worked. That was the only word for it. He sat in rooms with elders and alphas and his own people, the wolves of the First Pack who had emerged from 3 decades of hiding with the quiet competence of professionals who had been training for this their entire lives, and he reshaped the world Grace had grown up in. He did not ask her to be part of it. He did not ask her anything. This, Grace realized, was the point, the same point it had always been, from the log at the tree line to the cabin on the mountain. He did not ask. He made space. He waited. It drove her insane. She spent the first week at the Hartwell Pack House, sleeping in her old bedroom, which Catherine had stripped of her photos but not her books. She read at night and paced during the day, and argued with Lily about whether Ethan's deception was forgivable, arguments that went in circles because Lily, who had been kidnapped and rescued and was dealing with her own bruises, had the unnerving clarity of someone who had recently been shown exactly how bad things could get. "He saved me," Lily said. "He also lied to me for our entire marriage. Both of those things are true. You are annoyingly reasonable. I was kidnapped last week. I earned reasonable." Grace laughed, and the laugh surprised her, and the surprise made her eyes sting. She hugged her sister hard enough to make Lily squeak. She went back to the cabin on the 9th day. She did not tell anyone she was going. She took Ethan's truck, which he had left at the Hartwell house along with everything else that belonged to the life he had been living before the mask came off. She drove the hour and 15 minutes up the mountain on the dirt road that washed out every time it rained, and she parked between the 2 pine trees, and she stood on the slowly divorcing porch and breathed. The cabin smelled like cold wood and iron water and the ghost of his stew. She went inside. Everything was as they had left it. The kitchen table where the box had sat, the closet where the flannel shirts hung, the loft where they had lain in the dark and held hands and not held hands. She found the poetry book on the shelf above the bed. She had been studying. In the 9 days at the Hartwell house, she had found a reference guide to the old language in one of Ruth's books, and she had been teaching herself to read it the way you teach yourself to breathe at altitude, slowly, painfully, one gasping syllable at a time. She was not fluent. She was not close to fluent, but she could read one passage. She sat on the edge of the bed in the loft and opened the battered book to the page that fell open naturally. The spine cracked at this point, from being returned to again and again, and she read. The poem was about a wolf who loved a storm. The wolf knew the storm would never love the forest back, because storms do not love. They arrive and they leave and they change everything between arriving and leaving, and the things they change do not get to choose what shape they take afterward. So the wolf became a tree. Not because trees are strong, although they are, because trees are the thing storms need, the thing that stands, the thing that takes the lightning and grows around the scars, and remains when the storm moves on. The poem was not beautiful in the way that poems in greeting cards are beautiful. It was beautiful in the way that an X-ray is beautiful, showing you the structure beneath the surface, the bones that hold the body up when the body wants to fall down. Grace read it twice. Then she turned the page. The next verse was written in a different shade of ink. Newer, the handwriting the same, Ethan's careful angular script, but the ink was fresher, the words pressed harder into the page, as if the pen had been carrying weight. One line. Just one. She read it. Grace sat on the bed and held the poetry book in her lap and looked at the single line that Ethan had written after the summit, after the barefoot girl with the ruined mascara crashed into his evening and asked a rogue to marry her. One line that did in 6 words what every conversation, every silence, every held hand in the dark had been trying to do. She closed the book, she pressed it against her chest, she sat on the bed in the loft of the cabin on the mountain, and breathed. Then she called him. He answered on the second ring. "I read your poem," she said. Silence on the line. Not the empty kind, the kind that holds its breath. "I do not want to be your queen," Grace said. "I do not want to stand behind you at ceremonies and wave at alphas who tried to sell me and smile at elders who think my value is in my bloodline." "I know," Ethan said. "I want to change it." A pause. Change what? Everything. The summit, the mating traditions, the way daughters are traded like currency and bonds are treated like business deals, the way wolves like Dominic Ashford can exist inside a system that was supposed to protect people and instead protects power. That is not a small thing you are describing. I am not a small person. Another silence. This one was different. Through the bond, even across the distance, Grace could feel something shift. Not surprise. Recognition. The same recognition she had felt on the log at the tree line. The same frequency that had hummed between them when she proposed to a stranger in the dark. "What do you need?" Ethan asked. "I need the title, but on my terms. Not ceremonial, legislative. I want a seat at the table, not a chair behind it. I want the authority to restructure the bonding laws. I want the summit traditions reviewed and reformed. I want every daughter of every alpha to know that she is not a line on a spreadsheet." "Your father laminated that spreadsheet," Ethan said, and for the first time in weeks, she heard a trace of the man on the log, the dry, unhurried humor of someone who watched the world with clear eyes. "I know he did," Grace said. "That is why I am the right person for this." She came down the mountain the next morning. She drove to the Hartwell pack house, where Ethan was meeting with the Council of Elders, and she walked into the room in jeans and borrowed boots, and told a table full of wolves, who had governed for decades, exactly how their governance was going to change. They listened, not because she was the Alpha King's mate, not because of her bloodline or her family name, or the green silk dress that was still hanging in the closet of the cabin, a relic of a life she had shed like a skin. They listened because she spoke with the precise, furious clarity of a woman who had been treated as currency and had chosen, at every possible turning point, to refuse the price. She restructured the Queen's role from a ceremonial position to a legislative one. She proposed and implemented a review of all bonding traditions, starting with the summit's annual parade of unmated daughters. She drafted new laws protecting the autonomy of wolves in mating decisions, laws that required consent to be documented and witnessed, laws that made forced bonds a criminal offense rather than a cultural tradition. She banned the spreadsheet. Not literally. You cannot ban a spreadsheet. But she dismantled the system that made the spreadsheet possible, the web of political alliances and territorial calculations that turned daughters into commodities and bonds into mergers. Her mother, Catherine Hartwell, attended the first council session where Grace presented her reforms. She sat in the back of the room with her pearl earrings and her perfect posture, and her face arranged in the expression of a woman who was watching her daughter do something she did not entirely understand but could not entirely disapprove of. Afterward, Catherine found Grace in the hallway. "Your photos are back on the mantel," Catherine said. It was not an apology. Catherine Hartwell did not apologize. It was something harder and more honest. An acknowledgement that the world had changed, and that the woman who had changed it was the same girl Catherine had buttoned into a green dress and walked across a marble floor. Grace nodded. She did not hug her mother, and her mother did not reach for her, but something passed between them, fragile, real, that did not need words or contact to exist. Henry Hartwell did not adapt as gracefully. He sat in his study with his broken decanter and his diminished authority and watched his eldest daughter reshape the world he had built, and Grace did not know what he felt, because she had stopped trying to read his spreadsheets. She visited him once, sat across his desk the way she had sat as a child, when the desk seemed as large as a continent and her father seemed as permanent as geography. "You knew," she said, "for 12 years. "I did. Why did you not tell me?" Henry looked at his hands. They were the hands of a man who had held power so long he had forgotten that power was borrowed, never owned. Because if you knew he was a king, you would have run in the other direction. Grace sat with that, turned it over. Her father had kept the secret not to protect himself, but because he understood his daughter well enough to know that she would never have chosen a king willingly. And Ethan had kept the same secret for the same reason. The two men in her life, one who controlled and one who waited, had arrived at the same conclusion from opposite directions. Grace would only choose freely. Anything else would break her. She left her father's study without forgiving him. Forgiveness was a larger project than a single conversation, a renovation that would take years and might never be fully complete. But she left without anger, which was its own kind of beginning. She and Ethan did not return to the cabin with the broken porch. They did not move into the Hartwell pack house, or the Ashford estate, or any of the grand halls that the first pack had maintained in secret for 3 decades. They chose a house. Together. A house on the edge of the mountain territory, not too high and not too low, with a porch that stayed attached and a wood stove that worked when you asked it to. It had a kitchen large enough for 2 people to cook, without negotiating space, although Ethan still only made the stew. Grace unpacked the poetry book and placed it on the shelf in their bedroom. She unpacked the signet ring and the seal and the letter from Ruth. She unpacked the flannel shirts, all 7 of them, identical but apparently distinct in ways she was learning to perceive. She unpacked herself, not all at once, in pieces, the way you furnish a house, one decision at a time, each item placed with the knowledge that this is the thing, and this is where it goes, and this is the life you are choosing to build. Ethan watched her rebuild his kingdom from the chair he always sat in during council sessions, slightly behind her, slightly to the left, not because he was deferring, because he was doing what he had always done, making space, waiting, being the wall that catches rather than the wall that blocks. Grace Hartwell Cole, the girl who had fled a summit in bare feet with mascara on her jaw, the woman who had married a rogue to escape a spreadsheet, the queen who had rewritten the laws of an entire civilization because she refused to let another daughter be sold, stood at the front of the first Reformed summit and looked out at a room full of wolves who were learning, slowly and not always gracefully, what freedom looked like when it was not just a word but a structure. She looked across the room at Ethan, who was standing at the back, near the tree line, because old habits are patient things that do not die easily. He was wearing the worn jacket. He was watching her with those steady brown eyes. The bond between them hummed with something that was not warmth, not completion, not any of the poetic nonsense the old stories promised. It was partnership, the plain, stubborn, daily work of 2 people who had chosen each other in the dark and were choosing each other again in the light, not because it was easy or destined or written in the stars, but because the alternative was a laminated spreadsheet and a green silk dress and a life measured in political yield per offspring. Grace looked at the alpha king of the first pack, the rogue wolf who made one stew and spoke in single sentences and had written a poem about a wolf who loved a storm. He looked back at her from the tree line, and he smiled. It was the first time she had ever seen him smile. It changed his whole face. It made him look like a man who had been waiting a very long time for something he had been afraid to want. Grace smiled back. Then she turned to the room full of wolves and got back to work, because kingdoms do not reform themselves and spreadsheets do not burn themselves, and the future is not something that arrives. It is something you build, one law at a time, one refusal at a time, one barefoot, mascara-streaked, furious, impossible choice at a time. The porch of the new house stayed attached through the first winter. The wood stove cooperated. The stew remained the only thing Ethan cooked. Grace did not mind. She had learned, in the cabin on the mountain with the separating porch and the iron water, that the size of a life is not measured by the house you live in, or the title you carry, or the column you occupy on someone else's spreadsheet. It is measured by the things you refuse, and the things you choose, and the distance between the girl who ran barefoot into a forest and the woman who walked back out of it, carrying a crown she had earned, not inherited, not been gifted, not been sold, earned, every single day.